No? There we go. We're in this series of summer stories, and the idea is what we want to do is we want to take some familiar stories for us and try to pull some things out and just bring, I don't want to say life. Life is the wrong word because the Bible is alive and active. It's sharper than any two-edged sword. But sometimes we don't treat it that way. Sometimes we forget the power that is in here. Just as we just prayed for and we ask God to do what only God can do, we find those things and we find those promises here. They're not just made up. They're not just things that we feel or maybe this would be hopeful and be wonderful it could happen. There's things that God has promised and laid out here. But how many times do we open this up and we lose that joy, that excitement that we once had? There was that first time you heard this story, and I think that's why one of the benefits for those who have an opportunity to be in children's ministry, you get to tell the story of Daniel in the lion's den for the first time. And it's like, this is the greatest story ever. And then you get old and you're like, it's a story. And it shifts. There's all these incredible stories that when you first learn them and you first hear them, you're like, man, that's incredible. And then over time, it's not that the story gets less incredible. It's just you get less excited about it. You get less moved about it. And this is that constant surrender that we go to God, say, help me as I read your word, show me something, give me that great joy of knowing you and knowing your word. So we've gone through some stories this summer, and we looked at the life of Daniel. We looked at Nehemiah last week. Today we're going to look at the life of Esther. Now, I don't know how we're going to do this, to be perfectly honest with you. Normally my notes are about 1.5 pages to 2 pages. There's 7 pages today. We have a picnic afterwards. We've already eaten a lot of time. So we're going to fly through this. Because what I love about this story is that it's more than a story. It highlights 2 incredible things for us. It's going to highlight 2 incredible things through the entire book of Esther. One, it's that God is in control. It highlights the authority of God. And we're going to look at this as a reminder in just a second. It highlights the authority of God, but it also looks at what happens when we live and act and let our lives be impacted by the truth that God is in control. When we live that way, when we live with this understanding that God has authority, lives are changed. But there has to be this moment in our lives where we just kind of lean in and just finally embrace and say, God, ultimately, yes, you are in control. And because of that, I'm going to live like you are in control. That's exactly what Esther does here in this book, in this incredible story about her life. Now, real quick, when we talk about authority, we always go back to this theological term called the sovereignty of God, right? We talked about this last summer in our summer series as well. And there's 2 aspects of the sovereignty of God. Just these are reminders for you. There's God's decrees. These are specific things that God is saying, listen, I am saying all nature has to obey. These are his commands, non-negotiable. These are God's decrees. And then there's this thing called God's providence. And the way that we describe that, it says through divine providence, God accomplishes his will. To ensure that his purposes are fulfilled, God governs the affairs of men and works through the natural order of things. The laws of nature are nothing more than God's work in the universe. In short, whether it's God's decree or God's providence, the reality is everything is under the authority of God. Now, the way that he chooses to work is up to him. But the reality that he is in control is very clear and abundant. So that gets us into the book of Esther. The book of Esther, it's a unique time for God's people. They're in this kind of interim transition. This story of Esther, if you were reading through like a Bible plan, it's kind of in between chapters 6 and 7 of the book of Nehemiah. So Daniel had already come up on the scene, had already gone through his leadership, his rule, and as he moved up into authority under King Nebuchadnezzar and the other kings. Eventually he would get to this place where he was second command. All this stuff would take place, all under another country's rule. God would use Daniel to help draw people back to God, enter into the story who we talked last week, Nehemiah. Nehemiah who goes back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. All of this has taken place. This is about 30 years after Nehemiah first begins this process to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. It's addressing a group of Israel, people who are still in the nation of Persia. These people that are kind of stuck. They haven't gone back to Jerusalem for whatever reason. Maybe financially they didn't have the resources. Maybe they were comfortable, they developed a life, maybe they married into that area, and so now they have family. For whatever reason, they're still there. And it's in this time that King Xerxes is in control. And he starts off in chapter 1 and does something crazy. He calls his wife. Everybody is drunk. They're in these huge parties. He calls for his wife, the queen, to be brought and be put on display kind of as a show for everybody around in his party. And she says no. And he gets incredibly angry. He no longer, the queen is no longer the queen, and he begins this national search for a new queen. So they send out throughout all the nation of Persia, through every corner, that they're going to literally have a beauty pageant for the next queen for King Xerxes. And so this takes a year-long process. All this is going on, and the story starts off with these people of God, these Israelites, these Jewish people, living in a foreign land while God's people are being rebuilt back in Jerusalem. And there's a national search for a new queen. Does anybody have any idea who might become the new queen of Persia? So that jumps us forward, and we get into Esther chapter 2, verse 5. It says, "Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, the son of Jar, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken." So we're talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with that time frame. Verse 7, "Mordecai had a cousin named Haddish, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died." Mordecai does this incredible thing. He steps in and cares as a father figure for Esther, helps raise her, and takes care of her. So verse 17, as all this national search is going on for a new queen, it says, "Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave her a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his noble and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the province and distributed gifts with royal liberality." Immediately we see God's control in place. How does a foreigner become the queen of a nation? This is purely God's hand on Esther. Mordecai, her uncle, her father figure, works in the courts of the king and is there to keep an eye on her and help her. But God's hand is on her. When God is in control, it's amazing what happens. Things that don't make sense make sense. Things that shouldn't happen, happen. Esther, who is probably the last person other than her beauty in the nation who should be set up to be queen. She's not one of the people. But God's favor was upon her. God's authority was at play. And Esther rises through the ranks and finally is made queen. Look at Mordecai, what God begins to do under his authority in the life of Mordecai. In chapter 2, verse 20, it said, but Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do so. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigtha and Teresh, two of the king's officers, were guarding the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Why does that matter? God's at work. God's at work, and Mordecai is part of his plan. Mordecai has an incredible role. Obviously, the story is about Queen Esther, but when you really break down this book, there is no story of Esther without Mordecai. There is no story of Esther without Mordecai's wisdom, his guidance, his encouragement, his challenging at times. And in this place, Mordecai is put in the right place at the right time. Have you ever looked at being in the right place at the right time and just look at it as luck? Or can you look at being at the right place at the right time and realize, oh, what is God up to? Mordecai is in the right place at the right time. He overhears an assassination plot against the king. He brings it forward. Mordecai is celebrated because he revealed that story to the king. Move on to chapter 3. So much is happening. Mordecai, if you're making a movie, this is a great movie. Mordecai has an enemy named Haman. Haman hates Mordecai. He hates everything that Mordecai stands for. Haman is the right-hand man to the king. Haman convinces the king that everybody should bow down to him because his ego is so big. Mordecai's like, no, and refuses to bow down to Haman. That enrages Haman even more. All this is going on. There's all this tension going on. And God, under his authority, by the way, God is still in control in the good times, but also here in the bad time. Under God's authority, Haman convinces and comes up with a plan that everybody has to bow down to him. Those who do not bow down to him would be persecuted. Mordecai doesn't bow down. So to get back at Mordecai, here's Haman's plan. Let's get rid of all the Jewish people in our country. This is Haman's plan to get back against Mordecai. Let's go after not just the person, let's go after the nationality. King Xerxes agrees to it, signs this plan, and the plan becomes reality in that area. Mordecai, in chapter 4, he begins this process of mourning and weeping and fasting. He sits there. Esther hears about it. Esther sends him clothes, sends him food, and tries to say, you can't look like this in the presence of the king. Mordecai refused it all because he understood the situation that he was in was way bigger than just Mordecai. If it was just Haman and Mordecai, okay, we'll figure that out. Mordecai realized this was way bigger than me. This is about God's people. This is the persecution against God's people. And he refused. Mordecai would share the plan with Esther, what Haman was up to. And we get into the heart of the story in chapter 4. If you have your Bibles, turn to Esther chapter 4, verse 9. Hathach, who was a servant of Esther, went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Mordecai goes to Esther, tells Esther through her servant, you need to stand up for our people. You need to do something. Without your involvement, without you stepping in, there will be the mass murder of our people in this nation. And Esther, like you and I often do, we can be so quick to come up with every reason why not me. Now, by the way, Esther has a really good reason why not me. Esther says, I can't just show up. If I show up, I'm putting my life on the line. It wasn't like I'm busy. It wasn't like, man, he's way over there. Like, she had a real excuse. She had a real fear. She says, if I go into the presence of the king without being summoned, my life is at risk. Mordecai, do you realize what's being asked of me? And it's been 30 days since I've been called. In chapter 4, verse 12, it says, when Esther's words were reported back to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. And this tends to be, like, when you think of Esther, these are the verses that you think of. When you think of Esther's, these are the verses. And oftentimes we can take them and we can manipulate them, but before we bring you and I into this for a moment, just think about young Esther, this young queen who's in over her head, this young queen who's in a situation that she's terrified for herself, she's terrified for her people. She's in this situation, she probably feels lonely. She can't even talk to Mordecai face to face. They're sending messengers back and forth. And she hears this back from Mordecai. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. We're going to circle back there. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And it's that last phrase that we tend to look at is, who knows that maybe you're here for a reason. Right place, right time. There's a reason that God has you here. But there's something before that I love about Mordecai's response. It isn't just challenging Esther to say, you can do this, you're the right person. Do you see he sneaks in a little bit of credit there? Before he says that, he says, for you, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. The only reason Mordecai can make that statement is because he believes in the promises of God. He believes in the authority of God. He knows that if God's people will call out to my name, he will bring deliverance to them. And he's saying, listen, I believe that this is what's going to happen. But Esther, I want you to be a part of it. I want you to have a role in it. I believe that God is working uniquely in your life under God's authority to do God's plan. Maybe that's why you're in the position you are, Esther. But regardless, it's not about you, Esther. Deliverance will come from another. Mordecai had such faith in the promises of God. And if it wasn't that faith in the promise of God, he would never send Esther into that situation. Mordecai was not Esther's father, but you see this father love and father figure that he was for her. He cared for her deeply. He made sure every need was taken care of for her. He provided wisdom and guidance and protection and helped raise her. Sending this request was not just this little bit, it doesn't matter, you're the person that's in this place and it doesn't matter. No, it was as if he's telling his daughter to risk your life. You don't do that unless you believe in something bigger. You don't walk in that confidence unless it's not in Esther. Esther is insecure in this moment. She's scared in this moment. Mordecai's confidence isn't in Esther's. Mordecai's confidence is in the promises and the authority of God. He latches onto that, and that understanding of who God is determines how Mordecai lives. But it's also contagious. When you are around people, we've been talking about this more and more recently, there's just certain people you walk around, the people of incredible faith, there's something different about them, is there not? Like they walk through the trials that you go through, that I go through. They have the same problems, they have the same thing, but they walk through with such confidence. And it's really not this inner self-confidence. It's actually this very clear understanding inwardly of who we are and who we are not. But it's really this boldness and this confidence, this determination that God is God, that he is in control, his promises are true, and I'm going to latch onto that, and I'm going to allow that truth to impact how I live. That's Mordecai. And Esther hears it, she responds to it. In verse 15 it says, then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Esther was bought in, but even Esther understood this wasn't about her. She needed God's hand at play, so she does what we need to do. Spends time fasting and praying, is asking for God's incredible blessing on this moment before she enters into the king's presence. Esther goes through in the next few chapters, she's going to go to the king. She's going to make a request to the king. In essence, say, if I found favor in your eyes, will you do me a favor, King Xerxes? And he says, he says yes to it. He says, okay, I want to have a dinner. I want to invite you and Haman, Mordecai's arch enemy in this story. I want to invite you and Haman to my house for dinner. So they go have this dinner together. Esther's not saying anything at this time. She's simply going to ask for another dinner. After the end of dinner, she says, can we have one more? You, King Xerxes, and Haman, will you grace my presence again and come for dinner? It's during that time that Haman, our enemy in this story, whose head is pretty big already, remember he said, I want everybody to bow down to me. That's who we're talking about. He gets an even bigger head. He begins to boast about his power, to boast about all his authority, to boast that I got special dinners with the king and queen. Haman is living on cloud 9 at this moment. So during that night, King Xerxes is restless. And so this is what takes place. It says that night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the records of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found, recorded, that Mordecai had exposed this plot to assassinate him from the 2 king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. So he asked the question, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asks. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. By the way, this part of the story isn't that big of a deal. It's just my favorite part of the story, so we're going to keep reading it. Okay. Verse 4. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. Right place, right time. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Love the request. Love the request because as soon as Haman, with the biggest head somebody possibly could have, more self-confidence than anyone else in this world at this time, when he hears the king wants to honor somebody, Haman immediately goes, well, clearly he's talking about me. Like, I'm the only one in this nation who's worth being honored. So he says, this is my answer. He said, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights in honor and lead him on the horse through the city, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights in honor. I'm telling you, he's had this planned out. Like, this isn't on the top of his head. He's thought through this. Like, he hears it, and he says, I want the robe. I want the king's crest. I want somebody proclaiming me in the streets. Verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gates. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. I told you, it doesn't have a great part of the story. I just love this part of the story. Like, there's just a moment where it's like, finally the bad guy gets it. And so Haman, you have to picture him. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He rode Mordecai and led him on the horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights in. Could you imagine that moment for Haman? Can you imagine for Mordecai? I actually struggle for Mordecai here. On one hand, you're loving it. On the other hand, you're like, oh, Haman's just going to hate me even more now. Like, it's in a terrible situation. And that's what happens. Haman hates Mordecai even more. It says in verse 13, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. Haman's in this terrible state of mind now. He thought yesterday was fantastic. He had dinner with the king and queen. He thought he was about to be honored, and instead it was him having to honor his enemy and the people that he hated. And immediately after that is finished, he's rushed into this dinner. So Mordecai is honored, Haman is humiliated, and that's his frame of reference as he goes in. But here's what I love about this story of Esther. Here's what I love about the story of God's authority. Here's what I love about when we walk in understanding of this authority. God desires for evil to be defeated. I think at times we live in this world and we look at the evil and we look at the unrighteousness and it seems to be rewarded at times, right? It's hard. And I get it. I struggle at times. I'm watching things. I'm like, how is this life? Like, how is this okay? And there's times that we lose this understanding and we lose this reality that God truly desires for righteous to be upheld and for the unrighteous to be punished. And this is what happens when Mordecai and Esther live under the authority of God, walk in the authority of God, evil is defeated. In Esther chapter 8, verse 3, it said, Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan that Haman had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it is the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, the son of Hamneth, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's province. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacks the Jews, I give his estate to Esther. And they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his king's ring can be wrote." King Xerxes is not even setting the rules here. He hands over his ring to Mordecai and to Esther. He says, "You decide what needs to be done. What do you want for your people? You have all authority from me that it will be played out. We will take care of Haman, and we will restore your people." It doesn't just happen. You don't take somebody with the power, the authority, the person like King Xerxes who was willing to get rid of his queen because she wouldn't do exactly what he wanted, had this self-view of himself that he would go ahead and do a national search, spend a year to find his new queen. He thought so much of himself. And yet he watched Mordecai and he watched Esther, and God had favor on both of their life because he has his authority in place. That he hands over his ring and said, "You decide what happens in my name." That doesn't just happen. Like, this is weird. These are the parts of the story that when you're reading God's word, just pause and be like, how did that happen? Like, how does a King Xerxes, who's not a follower of God, be used mightily for God? Because God has authority. Because sooner or later the king will die, but God will reign forever. Sooner or later the king will be defeated, and God's sitting there like, "I'm still undefeated." God is in control. Xerxes hands over the ring. Verse 9, it says, "At once royal secretaries were summoned, and 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out all the Mordecai's ordered to the Jews and to the satraps, the governors, and nobles. The province stretched from Indian to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language for each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatch with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted carriers who rode fast horses especially bred for the kings." Not only was evil defeated, the Jews were celebrated, they were protected, they gathered to worship. You read in these chapters, they'll fight back against their enemies. They're free to defend themselves. They're free to worship their God. This is such a good reminder that God is always at work. These individuals were just days before, they just heard the order, they will die. And they're crying out to God to do something, but in belief that God is actually going to do something. And God shows up, and immediately these people they're not in Jerusalem, they're not at the temple, they're not there worshiping God in the presence of God. They're in a foreign land. Their hearts turn to God. They cry out to God. They see God at work, and they celebrate what he's done. God, remind ourselves that God is at work. God desires for righteous to be upheld. He desires for the unjust to be brought to justice. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8. Says, "The one who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work." God desires righteousness. God desires that in our life, but he desires this in this world. Even in the brokenness and the pain, he desires it. But lastly, look what takes place. God defeats evil, but in return, God is celebrated. God is worshiped. There's out of this time, in the final chapters here in chapter 9, there's actually a festival that is developed in God's people. A festival that's celebrated today in Purim. This is a multi-day festival where people remember that God saved their people. Today, Jewish people, once a year for 3 days, will come and they'll celebrate. They'll put on costumes. This is actually one of their biggest feasts as far as celebration. It's not one of their holiest feasts, but it's one of their biggest celebrations. They have costumes and parade. They eat food on top of food on top of food. And it's all there to remember that God saves. It's all there to remind them that God is in control. It's exactly what Mordecai was trying to get Esther to realize. When in the moment when the question marks are there. See, these are the moments that matter. what leads up to it is important. What happens afterwards, that's important as well. But it's in the moment. It's in that middle part where a decision is made. It's in the middle of, do I trust God or do I not? Do I lean into his promises, or do I fall back onto my own fears, my own insecurities, my own worries, my own selfish desires? It's in the middle part of that story what we have to determine in our hearts. Will I believe in the promises of God? Mordecai said to her, do you not think that because you are the king's house, you alone of the Jews will escape? For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. That's the type of faith that I want. I want the type of faith that believes in God's promises, but also recognizes my part in the story. I want to be able to say, God, I see you at work, and I want to be a part of that work. I don't want to pass it off to somebody else. We watch our students this week with Invert. They're all trying to find their part in the story. They're trying to find, what do I bring to the table? We as a church are trying to elevate them and say, you are part of God's story. You have a part in telling this story. You have a part in serving in this and an impact in this. This isn't just about entertainment. This is about your life. This is about an opportunity that you have to be used. But I say the same thing to you. What's your part in God's story? What is God wanting to use you in unique ways? Are you going to save a nation? Probably not. Can you reach your neighbor? I believe you can. Can you be a part of changing the story and the story of your family? Absolutely. Can you step up and serve in a unique way that God has prepared you to? I know you can. Why? Because you look throughout time, God has promised, his promises have stood true, that you can lean in on them, that you can embrace them. You can walk with confidence even when you are not confident. It's one of the greatest, I think that's the piece that we talk about from the Holy Spirit. You get up and do something, or you step out and take a step of action. You're not doing it under your own strength. It's oftentimes when we are is when we lack impact. When we are doing it under our own strength, or we just have enough ability to get by, we lose impact. But when you're like Esther, who has to spend 3 days fasting and praying and seeking God just to have enough courage to go before the king, it's at those moments, the middle part of the story, where our faith is found. It's where our reliance on God is really, really developed, and we begin to learn to trust. And then we get to the end of whatever that story might be, and we look back, and we're reminded of God's faithfulness. We're reminded of what he's done, because we're going to need that again in the future. You're going to have to reach back and draw on that equity of that faith that you have in God and his deliverance in your life, and you would draw from that again as new opportunities are in front of you, new chances, new middle parts of your story where decisions need to be made. God is at work, and all of that work is under his authority. You and I have to work on that middle, go, will I trust it? Will I live like God is in control? We can sing it. We're about to sing a song that talks all about God's authority. We can sing it all day. You can put it on the car on the way home. Will your decisions look like God has the authority? Will your actions look like God has authority? Will your giant steps of faith look like God has the authority? The story of Esther lays out God's control, lays out his power, cements his authority, but it's also about the story of people. The story of people when that they believe and lean into the authority of God, the power of God, the providence of God, lives are forever changed. And that's our part of the story, to be used by God to change lives. Father, we love you. We thank you for this time that we have together. Lord, I thank you for Esther. I thank you for her life and even the life that is still celebrated today. The way that you used her and the way that you put her at the specific places at specific times. But Lord, for her willingness to, even though there was doubt, even though there was fear, the willingness to still say yes. Lord, I desire that. I desire a doubt in my life, but willing to push past it and just simply say yes to you. Lord, I thank you for Mordecai in this story, Lord, and I thank you for the Mordecais in our lives who are constantly encouraging and constantly pushing. People who have such cemented faith in your promises that they're willing to allow it to not just impact their life, but impact the lives of those around them. Father, I pray that we would be this type of church. Lord, that we would be a mixture of people who are firmly planted and, Lord, people who are struggling, but Father, collectively, a group of people who are just trying to say yes to you. Lord, believing that you are in control, that you have all authority, that you have all reign, and Lord, that our lives and our church would just walk in the middle of that, making decisions based off of the reality that you are in control, taking steps of faith knowing that you are there to fill in the gaps. Father, give us that type of faith. Give us the faith of a Mordecai and give us the faith of an Esther to simply believe that you are in control and to live our lives with the reality of that truth. We love you and we praise you and we thank you for all that you do for us. In Jesus' name, amen.